Hi, I'm Brittany, a neurodivergent mum and speech pathologist. This is Not Just Theories, where I share what actually works in my real, messy life. Because life doesn't follow a theory. Here's what I actually do. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Not Just Theories. Today, I am up to episode 5 of my infant sleep series, which just feels like it's going really quickly. And I've been unpacking some of the biological and developmental factors that influence how babies sleep. So far, we've talked about circadian rhythms and wake times, different sleep needs across different children, medical barriers to sleep, with a second episode following up specifically about food allergies and gut discomfort. And today I'm going to be talking about another very important piece of the puzzle. All the pieces of the puzzle are so important. So today I'm going to be diving into sensory needs, because some babies struggle with sleep not because something is wrong, like medically or biologically, or with their timing or schedule, but because their nervous system needs a very specific type of input to settle. If that sensory environment doesn't match what their body needs, sleep becomes really hard. So that whole idea of a tired baby will go to sleep is just not true for some babies. Some babies will persist in being awake even when they're tired if the environment is not conducive for them to sleep. So we know all babies have sensory preferences because all humans process sensory information and have their own sensory preferences. And this includes things like movement and sound and light and touch and body position and proximity to other people. But we don't all process those things in the same way. Even from birth, babies can have really different sensory profiles. Some babies are sensory seekers and others are sensory avoidant. Many are a mix of both, depending on the situation. And understanding those differences can be incredibly helpful when it comes to sleep. Some babies maybe have a preference for their type of sensory environment, but their overall temperament is quite relaxed and they have a wider range of sensory environments that they'll be comfortable in, or a wider range of sensory inputs that are regulating and relaxing for them. Or they're, more internally regulated more of the time, and so it takes you less to help them get to sleep. So in the Possum's approach to sleep, which I mentioned before, the general idea is that to sleep, you need two things. You need sleep pressure, and then you need some way of dialing down the nervous system. And often that's something like a breastfeed or a rock or a cuddle. But for some children, they need a huge combination of those factors to be exactly right before they will then fall asleep. And figuring out your own child's unique sensory needs is going to make it so much easier, combined with getting that sleep pressure right by knowing what your child's sleep needs are, to get your child to sleep when they are tired. So if you have a sensory seeking baby, that often means they need more input to regulate their nervous system. So they might really love movement, and they might settle best when they're rocked or bounced or walked. And rocking a baby can be so much more vigorous than many of us picture before we have a child. So I know when I pictured someone rocking a baby, it was this gentle swaying rock. But actually, some children who need to be rocked to sleep, they are doing really big sweeping rocking motions. It's quite exhausting. So it's not even just sensory seeking babies might not just need that movement, but they might need quite large movements within that motion to regulate. And it often needs to be quite rhythmic as well. So it might not be just sort of back and forth with a little bit of a jiggle. It might need to be quite well timed as well. So often these babies will find it easier to fall asleep in a pram or a car if you've got that sort of big noisy background of the car and they've got that comfortable position if they like their car seat, all the noise, all of the movement all the time. So sometimes these children are often the ones who might fall asleep in those environments. And often sensory-seeking babies enjoy being carried. They relax when the world is moving. So you might find yourself pacing the house or bouncing on an exercise ball, walking your child round and round and round the block with a pram or over a bump again and again and again. Doing endless laps of the living room. So I remember with my daughter, I actually had positioned several rugs to create multiple edges to rock the pram over to keep her asleep. So not only did I have to have the pram moving to get her to sleep, but for her to stay asleep, I needed to be constantly moving her back and forth over a bump. Not just move it, she had to be going up and down as well on like a rough surface if I wanted her to stay asleep in the pram. So this is not about creating like bad habits, going for those pram naps, car naps. It's not a bad habit if it's what your child needs, because movement is regulating for some babies' nervous systems. On the other hand, some babies are quite sensory sensitive or avoidant, and those babies can be overwhelmed really easily by stimulation. So these babies often prefer quiet environments with dim lighting, sometimes some gentle movement, not those big bounces. Predictable routines can really help these babies, because too much sensory input can actually make sleep harder. So thinking about whether or not you are or are not using white noise. So some babies really settle with white noise because it sort of evens things out, but others, that white noise itself might be too stimulating. A dark room can be quite calming for some babies, really gentle, rhythmic shushing, and minimal visual stimulation. So making sure walls are clear, there's not things going on, there's not a fan and, all these colourful toys on the floor. So all of that can help reduce sensory overload and support sleep for a certain type of baby. Some babies also have really strong needs specifically around proximity and connection. And these are what we affectionately call a Velcro baby. And I definitely had one of these. So these are babies that prefer to be held or worn in a carrier, or they like contact naps and sleeping really close to a caregiver. For those babies themselves, the closeness itself is the best way for them to regulate their nervous system, that sensory regulation, because being on and around their caregiver is a huge sort of sensory comfort for them. There's the touch and the warmth and the smell and the heartbeat. All of those things send signals of safety to the nervous system. So if those signals disappear, if you put your baby to sleep and then put them down, the baby may wake quite quickly afterwards. And this is not them manipulating you. It's just that is the way they best regulate. They borrow our regulation. So for Velcro babies in particular, baby wearing can be incredibly helpful because that carrier can provide multiple sensory inputs at once. So it's closeness and warmth. It also provides a bit of gentle pressure, and often there's movement. If nothing else, from the parent breathing, there's movement, but usually that's also off parent walking around or swaying. And that sound combined of the parent breathing and their heartbeat is like a gentle, rhythmic, soothing thing for their nervous system. So that combination of all of those sensory inputs is exactly what many infants' nervous systems are wired for. The benefit of baby wearing, as opposed to a contact nap on a couch or something, is that it can give some parents a much needed freedom to move around while they're still meeting their baby's needs. So although I do love a good long contact nap especially in the early postpartum days when you do need to be physically resting, particularly when I had my second baby, that baby wearing for naps was so helpful that I could still go out and do things with my toddler while I was still letting my baby sleep. So those are fantastic. I learned to do everything with the carrier on. I could clean, I could do almost everything except pretty much washing up was one of the hardest things because I couldn't quite reach the dishes around the baby. I could use the bathroom, I could eat or drink certain foods as long as I was really careful about temperature. So baby wearing can be an amazing solution, especially for daytime sleep. The nighttime equivalent of baby wearing in our family became bed sharing, because our baby, who needed that constant proximity during the day, also struggled without that close proximity at night. And that really constant cycle of like settle your baby, transfer them to the cot, then the baby wakes up and you repeat it again was so exhausting, especially when we're talking about, not just 2 or 3 or 4 wakes a night. This is every single 30 to 40 minute window we were having to do that. And this is something that particularly with my first I was quite anxious about, and it wasn't something I tried until much later in the journey with her. So I think with my first we started doing some bed sharing around the 1-year-old mark because I was just so desperate at the end of my rope and back at work at that point, and she was sort of bigger and I felt much safer. With my youngest, it was more like when he started crawling, so around that 7 or 8 month mark, because bed sharing does come with risks. So families should absolutely look into the safe sleep guidelines before they're making that decision to bed share. For our family, I had full-term healthy babies. I was breastfeeding. I sort of followed all the guidelines. We had a very firm mattress, all of the things that make it safer. I did also wait until my babies were a little bit older and out of sort of that highest risk window, although for many families, bed sharing from earlier is much more manageable for them. My anxiety didn't personally allow me to do it when my babies were younger. But certainly, countries where bed sharing is the norm do not have higher SIDS incidences, places like Japan. So look into safe sleep guidelines, look into things called like the Safe Sleep 7, and decide whether bed sharing is an option for your family. But for us, it was just getting to the point where it was the safest option for our family, because the amount of weeks we'd had over such an extended period of time, I was so at risk of falling asleep on the couch or, anywhere other than the bed with my baby, which is actually so much more dangerous. Sharing a surface with a baby when you have not prepared to do so is the most dangerous way to share. So falling asleep on the couch is one of the more dangerous things you can do. And if setting ourselves up for safe bed sharing meant that the mattress was prepared, pillows were out of the way, my hair was tied up, I hadn't had any alcohol, all of those things that make it safer was better for our family. So I wouldn't recommend that you do this if it's not something that fits within your comfort decision. But certainly for our family and my child, we all got a little bit more rest. Because if nothing else, it made all of those nighttime wakes much more sustainable, because I could wake to really small wake ups without having to fully get up every time. I didn't need to move around, so it didn't wake my body up quite so much. And once my baby was asleep, I then didn't need to resettle her and risk waking her up at that point. So it was sort of a lot easier for us to manage, much more sustainable. So not a magic solution, but more sustainable. And knowing what we do now about her sensory regulation, she is still a child who requires more physical comfort from us. So she's just a kid who, like, when she wakes up in the morning, she still just wants to really like sit on our lap and cling to us when she's uncomfortable, all of those sorts of things. It's the opposite when she's upset. Like if she's angry with us or anything, then in that situation, touch can be quite overwhelming for her. But certainly when she's not upset, but just trying to settle down, that comfort and closeness really helps. Another incredibly powerful sensory regulator for babies is sucking. Babies are biologically wired to suck for comfort, and so breastfeeding often becomes one of the primary ways babies regulate themselves. For many families, introducing a dummy or pacifier can also be really helpful. In our case, introducing a dummy actually saved our breastfeeding relationship, because before that, my baby wanted to feed constantly for comfort, partly because of the allergies that I spoke about last week, and I was getting completely overwhelmed. I'm actually quite sensory avoidant and sensitive, and it was all too much for me to have somebody constantly on me. But once we introduced that dummy, it gave my baby another way to access that soothing, sucking reflex without me being the only option every time. So for some babies, that small change can make a really big difference. And I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about feeding to sleep and habits, and, the way your baby goes to sleep at the start of the night is the way that they'll expect to be put back to sleep during the night, and that's what causes all the constant wakes and everything like that. But we actually found that for our baby, that wasn't the case. So neither of my children have sort of had issues. If they've gone to sleep at the start of the night without breastfeeding, that doesn't stop them from wanting to be breastfed back to sleep during the middle of the night. So if people don't think it works the other way, I don't understand why people think it works that first way. Anyway, it's very confusing. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and some families prematurely night wean because they're worried that the feeding back to sleep is what's causing all of the sleep issues. But I cannot tell you how many people that I am in contact with, mostly through the Beyond Sleep Training Project, who night weaned and then their baby still woke up, but they'd lost the easiest, quickest way of settling their baby back to sleep because they were no longer breastfeeding overnight. So, it's one of those cautionary tales, getting rid of breastfeeding overnight. If it works for your family, do what works for your family, but it's not a magic bullet. And if your baby then wakes up overnight and you can't do that quick and easy feed back to sleep, have a think about what your alternatives will be. So just a note of caution on that one. For our kids, they eventually night weaned on their own timelines, and were able to, reduce that down as needed in our family. Another sensory input that can really help regulate babies is sound, because some babies really settle beautifully with that rhythmic auditory input. So a lot of families naturally do this. This is things like white noise or shushing or humming or singing the same lullaby over and over. That rhythm and repetition can signal safety and predictability to the child's nervous system. So many cultures around the world use lullabies as part of a bedtime routine, and there is a reason that lullabies have persisted across generations. It's because they work. They work for so many children. It's often not the only piece, but certainly, if it's not something you've tried and you are at the end of your tether, I don't know anyone who's got to the end of their tether with sleep who hasn't tried lullabies or, changing what kind of sound that their child is listening to. Both of my children have, had poetry read to them overnight to put back to sleep, because that's my husband's sort of preferred rhythmic auditory input. But for other babies, soothing might not be about adding sensory input. It's actually about reducing it. So I mentioned earlier that, some children are quite sensory avoidant rather than sensory seeking. And children can have mixed profiles depending on the type of input. So my eldest child was a perfect example of that sort of combination, where she really, really needed that motion and that physical contact and that sucking. But she had what I jokingly call extreme FOMO, fear of missing out. If there was anything vaguely interesting to look at, she would try desperately to stay awake, even when she was clearly exhausted. So eventually we realized she actually needed visual input blocked in order to fall asleep. So we would rock her with a blanket over her face. So she would have a dummy in, or she would be breastfeeding, big rocks, singing. We sorted out wake windows. So all of those things, but we had to put a blanket or a cloth over her eyes to block the visual stimulation. And even now, she's 4. And she says out loud, I can't close my eyes. She needs lights off, or she needs me to put my hand over her face. If we're reading books, she often needs to not be looking at the book if she wants to actually fall asleep to the sound of me reading it. So we do a lot of audiobooks in our house, or I'll read it, but she'll roll over so she can't see it. So she knows that she can't fall asleep, but she also really struggles to shut her eyes. So blocking her visual input by either holding my hand over her eyes, putting a blanket or towel when she was a baby over her eyes, not over her face, obviously, so not over her nose and her mouth. She was always able to breathe, blocking that visual input somehow. Some babies respond really well to a forward stroke. So if you do a gentle forward stroke down from their forehead onto their nose, they will instinctively close their eyes. And if you can sort of do that enough times, that helps them reduce that visual stimulation, and they might eventually close their eyes to fall asleep. So that way of disappearing the visual input would help my child finally relax. And eventually her eyes would close. So it looks really unusual from the outside. We definitely had people stare at us if we were in the corner of a room rocking our child and she had a towel on her head. But for her, that's what worked. It made complete sense. So figuring out what kind of sensory inputs or reductions in input work for your child is one way to sort of think about things. And for those kids who really love motion, pram naps, car naps, carriers, that vibration and rhythm helps their nervous system regulate. So I know a lot of traditional sleep advice really focuses on having babies sleep in quite controlled environments. But historically, babies have slept in many contexts, including while being carried or moving. And for some families, pram naps and car naps are a really practical solution. So I think that's something that's really important to allow if that's what works for your family. As it is, now that my youngest has self-weaned from breastfeeding, he's really hard for me to put to sleep because I never had to develop any of the other ways of putting him to sleep. He'll go to sleep for other people with a bit of rocking or shushing or anything, but with me, he won't. So when I'm alone with him and my eldest, we just use the car and the pram. That's how we get him to sleep, and it works for us. It's also really interesting. So obviously some babies really benefit from that darkened room. But if that's the only way you've ever done naps and your child is having trouble with waking a lot overnight, it might be worth considering whether having their day naps happen in the light and out and about with all of the daily noise happening around them might actually help, because sometimes babies actually nap too deeply and too long, and it can mess with their melatonin production if they're in a dark room for too much of the day. Again, we're back to the possum's approach. The purpose of day sleep is to help reset the sleep pressure just enough so that your child can get through to their next sleep, whether that be the next nap or the nighttime. If your baby sleeps for too long and too deeply during the day, it can interfere with their sleep pressure at nighttime, and it can make it harder for them to stay asleep or go to sleep at the start of the night. So if sleep is a challenge for you and you are having these lovely long naps during the day in a dark room and nighttime sleep is the challenge, have a think about whether having more naps on the go in the light with the daily noise around them might naturally shorten your child's day sleep and help them understand that day sleep and night sleep are two different things. They're for a different purpose. So definitely something to consider. There's a lot of science about the benefits of shorter day naps for children who are poor sleepers. And for our family, this definitely helped, not just for the child, but for my mental health, because if my child was needing to nap in a dark, quiet, calm room and they were needing a contact nap, or they'd, wake up immediately as soon as I put them down in the cot, that was awful for my mental health to be in a dark room for so much of each day. Whereas once I sort of lent into they'll sleep for as long as they sleep, we can do naps on the go. I mean, it helps that my children would both nap in the carrier or the pram or the car. But even contact naps on the couch, making sure that I wasn't making the environment around them so quiet that nothing woke them up. I'm not talking about things like, like setting up super loud noises near them so they got used to it. It was more just that, if they'd had a bit of a longer contact nap and somebody rang the doorbell and they woke up, sort of I didn't freak out about that, because it was like, well, they've had some day sleep, now they're awake and they'll have another nap when they have another nap, or they'll go to sleep when it's nighttime. And I know, again, it's always easier said than done, but sort of understanding what the day sleeps were for helped me relax so much when the day sleep didn't go as I'd sort of hoped it would, or as I'd planned that it would. And letting go of that little bit of control was a game changer for my mental health. So it's a spiral, because obviously with stronger mental health, it's easier to let things go. But letting things go really helps with your mental health. So for me, reading a lot about that possum's approach, and, the fact that, yes, maybe my child's on one nap now and they've only had a 15-minute nap and normally they nap for an hour. Instead of going, well, maybe today they'll have a second 15-minute nap later today. And that's what sleep will look like today, and we'll get through it. And rather than being like, oh no, it's 11:30 and my child needs to sleep for 1 hour and 20 minutes for their midday nap, otherwise everything's a disaster, really helped. So we still kept quite strict guidelines about the latest time that we would let our children sleep, because we did find that later naps in the day really, really impacted on the night. But in terms of the amount of sleep, if it was less than we expected, it was much easier for me to let that go. than it was for me to deal with when my children had too much day sleep, because too much day sleep always led to a horrific night for us. Anyway, went on a little bit of a tangent there, because the next thing I wanted to talk about when we're speaking about sensory profiles is that some babies who show really strong sensory differences or preferences early on may later be identified as neurodivergent, and that might include things like autism. But it is important to say not every sensory sensitive baby is neurodivergent. We know that. Sensory variation exists across the whole population. The thing that matters most is understanding your individual child's nervous system and responding to that with curiosity and compassion. But what we do know is that every child who is diagnosed with autism, who is autistic, was an autistic baby once. And some of these early sensory differences, in hindsight, can be explained when you fully understand who your child is. So one of the most helpful shifts parents can make is letting go of the idea that there's like one correct way to settle babies, and instead think about matching the strategies to your specific child. And this will probably be different for each of your babies. Some babies need movement and bouncing and rocking and pram naps and car naps, and others need quiet and darkness and minimal stimulation. Some need closeness, some need deep pressure or containment. So you often see that really early on. Some babies love being swaddled and they'll like almost immediately go to sleep. And other babies will fight to get out of a swaddle because it is not calming for them. Some babies need a combination of these things depending on the particular, sense. So if your baby does seem to have really strong sensory preferences, whether that's needing lots of movement, lots of closeness, or the opposite, in a very calm, hands-off environment, you're probably not imagining it, because babies are individuals from the very beginning. So when we start to understand how their nervous system works, sleep can become a little easier to navigate. So not perfect, but more understandable, because you'll be matching your child's sensory environment more to their needs rather than treating them like some cookie cutter baby. Your baby is a person and they will have their own unique sleep preferences. And just because somebody else's baby loves a particular way of being put to sleep doesn't mean your baby will too. So thanks for being here this week. I hope you're enjoying this little series on sleep. Next week, I will be talking a little bit about how to maximize an adult's sleep when you have a child who is not a sleeper. So talk to you next week. Until then, take care. Thanks so much for listening to Not Just Theories. I really appreciate you being here. If this episode resonated with you, the best way to support the show is to follow, leave us a rating or review, or just share this episode with someone else who you think might find it comforting or useful. I hope to see you back here soon.